Duke rescued a mother and her 3 children in the frozen wilderness. What happened next shocked everyone. The wind cut through the barren forest like a scythe, carrying with it the sharp tang of ice and the faint, desperate scent of smoke. Snow lay thick upon the ground, each flake a crystal dagger that clung to lashes and hair, and every breath the woman drew clouded the frigid air with trembling white. She stumbled over a fallen branch, clutching her youngest child to her chest, the infant's soft whimpers swallowed by the roar of the storm. Behind her, 2 older children clung to her skirts, their small hands numbed, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Each step was a battle against the bitter cold that sought to pry the warmth from their bodies and the hope from their hearts. She had been walking for hours or perhaps days. Time was meaningless when survival was measured in shivering breaths and the fragile warmth of trembling fingers. Her name was Eleanor, though the world had long ceased to remember her in anything but whispers and pointed fingers. Once, she had been counted among society's gentlewomen, a lady of refined bearing and modest fortune, admired for her careful manners and whispered promise of wit beneath her composed exterior. But a sudden misfortune, an untimely death, an unkind betrayal, or perhaps a scandal no one could remember clearly, had cast her into the margins, a shadow in the halls where velvet curtains concealed more than opulence. Now, stripped of comfort, of warmth, of the unspoken protections that a name could provide, she moved through the wilderness not as a lady, but as a mother, raw and exposed, her dignity bound not in silk or lace but in the tremulous determination that kept her children alive. Her gaze lifted through the flurries, scanning the skeletal trunks of ancient pines, searching for something she could not name, a shelter, a path, a miracle. And then, through the swirling whiteness, she saw him. A figure, distant but unmistakable, standing upon a ridge where the snow fell in sheets around him. The Duke. He was as she had imagined only in the stolen fragments of dreams and whispered fantasies she had forced herself to abandon long ago. Tall, commanding, the very air around him taut with authority and restraint, yet beneath that rigid composure a presence that hummed with quiet intensity. His coat was dark, a silhouette against the blinding white, and even at that distance she could sense the controlled power of his movement, the deliberate grace that marked every action as decisive, every gaze as piercing. Eleanor's heart faltered. It was not simply awe, though awe there was in abundance. It was fear as well, mingled with the faint, impossible spark of hope. Society had taught her to fear men of power, to bow under their scrutiny, to shrink and make herself small lest she draw attention and invitation to judgment. And yet here he was, seemingly unshaken by the storm, his eyes, not unkind but assessing, fixed upon her and her trembling children. A part of her told her to run, to vanish into the white wilderness, to cling to the illusion of invisibility. But another, more desperate part, the part that clung to the tiny fragile flame of survival, knew that perhaps salvation came upon 2 legs, clad in dark fabric and authority. He advanced with caution, each footfall muted by snow, yet she could sense the weight of his approach. It was as though the earth itself recognized his presence, bending and bowing beneath him. Eleanor's children, sensing the shift in the air, huddled closer, their small bodies trembling against hers. She called to them softly, whispering reassurances she scarcely believed, her own teeth chattering. "We must keep moving, my loves." "Keep moving," she murmured, each word a prayer against the storm and the despair gnawing at her spirit. The wind stole her voice as if offended by its trembling resolve, yet still she pressed onward, her feet dragging through the snow that threatened to pull them all under. The Duke reached them at last. There was no grand proclamation, no flourish of heroism in the cinematic sense. Rather, there was presence, suffused with an intensity that demanded recognition. He bent toward her children, his gloved hands steady and sure, lifting the youngest with the ease of one accustomed to care yet unaccustomed to sentiment. "They will not suffer here," he said, voice low and deliberate, each syllable measured as if weighed against some moral scale. Eleanor blinked against the wind, caught between suspicion and wonder, unable to speak, her fingers still clinging to the scarves and hats she had torn from her own coat to protect them. He placed the child against his chest, adjusting the small blanket she had nearly frozen through, and there was a moment, fleeting, electric, when Eleanor saw not only a protector but a man who recognized suffering and chose to shoulder it without hesitation. Her mind recoiled at the thought, as scandalous as any ball or whispered rumor, that a man of his stature would stoop, literally and figuratively, to aid someone so diminished by circumstance. Yet the impulse to recoil was tempered by relief so profound it left her breathless. "Madam," he said, extending a hand not in command but in offer, a bridge over the chasm of shame and exhaustion that separated her from trust. Eleanor's fingers hovered above it, trembling, uncertain. To take it was to submit to aid, to admit vulnerability. To refuse it might condemn her and her children to the merciless white. Her gaze flicked to the ridge, to the path disappearing into the storm, then back to him, and slowly, with trembling courage, she let her hand brush his. The Duke guided them with a calm, relentless determination, each step deliberate, each gesture protective. He never pressed, never whispered social judgment. Instead, he led as if instinct alone demanded it, his eyes scanning the horizon, noting each hazard, measuring the depth of snow and ice as though it were a map only he could decipher. The children, sensing his authority and benevolence, relaxed slightly, though fatigue still weighed heavily upon their small shoulders. As they moved toward a cluster of trees that promised temporary shelter, Eleanor allowed herself a stolen glance. Snowflakes clung to his hair, the line of his jaw was sharp against the pallid winter light, and his eyes, even in the storm, held a warmth that was foreign and intoxicating. She had thought herself immune to hope, or at least had forced herself to believe it a luxury she could not afford. Yet in that instant she felt it, a fragile, tremulous seed taking root amidst despair. And yet, even in the presence of aid, fear lingered. Eleanor's mind, trained for years to anticipate censure, whispered that salvation would not come without cost. Society's gaze was a shadow that could stretch across leagues of snow and ice, and she wondered, with a shiver that had nothing to do with cold, what whispers might follow her into warmth and safety. The Duke set the children upon a downed tree, brushing snow from their hair and coats, and Eleanor knelt beside them, her fingers lingering on their small, cold hands. He watched her then, silent, giving her space yet offering a presence so commanding it was as if the storm itself bent around him. In that quiet, terrifying moment she recognized a choice, to trust and be seen, to let someone of power into the fragile interior of her shattered world, or to retreat once more into the wilderness, alone and unprotected. The wind gusted, tearing at scarves and skirts, and in its howl, Eleanor heard both threat and invitation. She looked at the Duke, and for the first time in weeks, or perhaps months, her voice returned, frail but unwavering. "If you wish to help, then help us truly. There is no time for hesitation." He inclined his head, and in that single deliberate motion, a pact was formed, not merely of rescue but of recognition. She had survived thus far through fear, cunning, and the stubborn resilience of a mother, but now for the first time she allowed herself to hope that courage might be shared, that salvation might be extended, and that even in the harshest winter human kindness could blaze like a torch against the cold. As they moved toward the shadowed grove that promised temporary reprieve, Eleanor's heart beat with the heavy, uncertain rhythm of one who has glimpsed mercy and is unaccustomed to its presence. Snow swirled around them, and somewhere in its furious descent, a sound, a faint crunch upon the ridge, made her pause. She turned, eyes wide, and for the first time, truly saw the Duke not as an abstract hope, but as a force whose presence might change the course of their lives forever. And in that frozen wilderness, amid the howl of the storm and the clinging white of relentless snow, a quiet truth settled over Eleanor. Survival was no longer her sole concern. Something far more dangerous and far more wondrous had begun to stir in her chest. The Duke's carriage emerged from the swirling whiteness as though conjured by the storm itself, its polished panels glinting with frost and lantern light. Eleanor, wrapped tightly in blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, held her children close as the door opened. The warmth of the interior struck her like a reprieve from a world that had long offered none. Velvet cushions beneath small bodies, firelight reflecting on polished wood, the faint aroma of pipe smoke and spiced tea lingering in the air. The children stirred, hesitant, marveling at comfort so unfamiliar, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, part relief, part fear. Safety, she realized, carried its own weight. He moved with quiet authority, guiding them to a room that had been prepared in anticipation, and Eleanor's heart both lifted and recoiled. The space was orderly, untouched by the chaos they had endured, and yet every detail, the lace curtains, the polished floor, the crackling hearth, spoke of a world from which she had been exiled. She feared it would demand manners she no longer possessed, that the society which had cast her aside would somehow find her even here. The Duke seemed to read her hesitation. "It is enough that you are here," he said, his voice measured, low, and carrying the weight of certainty. "No one need question your presence within these walls." He set the children upon a low chair by the fire, arranging small cushions and a thick blanket, and for a moment Eleanor simply watched, captivated by the deliberateness of his care. There was no condescension, no distant curiosity. He moved among them as one who understood the fragility of both bodies and hearts. She dared to breathe more freely, though suspicion lingered like a shadow behind every flicker of the fire. Could she trust him? Could she allow herself even this fragment of hope? The Duke departed briefly, and upon his return, he carried small parcels, each wrapped in plain cloth but clearly chosen with consideration. For the children, he had brought simple tokens: a carved wooden horse for the eldest, a set of painted blocks for the second, and a delicate rattle for the infant. Eleanor's chest tightened as she watched the youngest squeal with delight, the sound a bomb that cut through the tension coiling in her shoulders. It was not extravagance that he offered, but attentiveness, a subtle acknowledgement of their humanity amidst hardship. Yet with kindness came the weight of judgment. A servant, a woman with keen eyes and lips pressed thin, lingered at the doorway long enough for Eleanor to notice the curl of suspicion in her glance. Rumor, Eleanor knew, traveled swiftly, faster than snow drifting down a winter sky. "Why is a lady of such circumstance," the servant murmured as she passed, "under the protection of the Duke?" Eleanor's fingers clenched the blanket tighter and her pulse quickened. Even here, in this haven of warmth, the threat of whispers and judgment pressed against her. The Duke, perceiving the tension without need of words, guided her to a chair near the fire. He removed his gloves, revealing hands that were large, capable, and yet not unkind. He offered her a cup of tea, the fragrance sharp with bergamot, and she accepted, trembling. "The world," he said quietly, "will always seek to measure you against its own rigid rules. I see only what is before me, your courage, your care for these children, and the truth of who you are." His gaze held hers steadily, as if to impress upon her that she need not shrink or hide. Eleanor's throat constricted, and she lowered her eyes, uncertain how to respond. Words of gratitude seemed too small, too frail, yet silence felt inadequate. In the ensuing hours, the children explored their temporary refuge under the watchful eyes of the Duke and Eleanor. The eldest traced the edges of the polished furniture with small, careful fingers. The second laughed as he rolled the blocks across the floor. The infant gurgled contentedly in his mother's arms. Eleanor found herself observing the Duke with a quiet fascination. How his eyes softened when he spoke gently to the children, how a corner of his mouth twitched when the infant reached for his coat, and how, in the flicker of firelight, he seemed both unyielding and achingly vulnerable. She could not decipher him fully, and yet the stirring of something she had long denied herself, a fragile curiosity, a dangerous longing, rose unbidden in her chest. Evening came, and with it the echo of the outside world. A letter had arrived at the estate, delivered by a rider cloaked in frost and fatigue, bearing news Eleanor dreaded. It was a missive, brief and polite, yet sharp with implication. Society had noticed her absence, her sudden appearance under the Duke's roof. Whispers would follow, scrutiny would arrive, and questions would be asked that she could not answer without compromising her dignity or her children's safety. Eleanor folded the paper with trembling hands, aware that the security within these walls was still a fragile veneer over a reality that would not wait for her to catch her breath. The Duke noticed her distress. He did not ask what the letter contained. He only placed a steady hand upon her shoulder, his presence a shield against both wind and whisper. "Let them come," he said, voice low, firm yet unshakably calm. "They will find nothing but the truth they refuse to see, that your place and theirs is not dictated by rumor, but by courage, by care, and by the choices we make." Eleanor looked at him then, truly looked, and for the first time wondered if there might be a man in this world whose gaze did not wound, whose judgment did not wound her further, but whose presence might offer shelter for the heart as well as the body. The children, sensing the tension, gathered closer, their small warmth a tether to reality. Eleanor smoothed the hair of the eldest, whispered a quiet assurance to the second, and kissed the infant's cheek. In this room, with the storm thrumming against the walls, the flicker of candlelight illuminating their small faces, she felt an emotion she had almost forgotten: hope. Yet it was tempered by the knowledge that this sanctuary was not impervious, that society's scrutiny could pierce even the most carefully guarded walls, and that trust, dangerous and alluring, was a choice she would have to make again and again. The Duke moved to the hearth, his shadow stretching across the room like a promise, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of the depth beneath his calm exterior. A man accustomed to authority, yet willing to set it aside to shield those in need. There was a magnetism in the way he stood, a quiet command that made the air itself seem heavier with anticipation. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, not only from fear of exposure, but from the pull of something far more compelling, far more unspoken, weaving its way through the room with the smoke of the fire and the soft murmurs of her children. Night settled heavily over the estate, blanketing the snow-laden grounds in silence. Eleanor tucked the children into the prepared beds, their small bodies already succumbing to exhaustion, and she lingered at the doorway, watching the flicker of lamplight on the polished floors. The Duke approached quietly, offering no intrusion, only the presence that had become both anchor and enigma. Eleanor met his gaze, and in that brief moment, she understood that the storm outside was nothing compared to the turbulence of what might unfold within these walls. As she returned to her own chair by the fire, the letter still folded in her hand, Eleanor realized the full weight of her position. Rescued, yes, yet not without consequence. Protected, yes, yet still at the mercy of forces she could neither predict nor control. The Duke's quiet attention lingered, a subtle yet undeniable challenge, and she knew that the path ahead would demand courage beyond mere survival. The storm raged outside, yet in the warmth of the estate, amid tokens of kindness and whispers of scandal yet to arrive, Eleanor felt the first delicate stirrings of hope, and an equally fragile, impossible curiosity about the man who had changed the course of their lives with nothing more than presence and purpose. And then, as the wind rattled the window panes and the firelight danced across the polished wood, a soft sound, the deliberate, measured step of someone approaching the house, paused Eleanor's heartbeat. She glanced toward the door, the shadows stretching and twisting, and understood with sudden clarity. The world outside was already coming for them, and the choices she would make in the coming hours might shape not only her own fate, but the hearts of those who had, until this moment, seemed untouchable. The nursery was quiet except for the faint rustle of blankets and the soft breathing of the children, each lost in dreams warmed by the firelight. Eleanor lingered near the cradle, brushing a stray lock of hair from her infant's forehead, her fingers trembling slightly despite the hearth's comforting heat. The Duke entered then, silent as a shadow, and for a moment she did not speak, caught between instinctive reserve and the strange, compelling trust that had begun to root itself within her. He moved closer, lowering himself into the armchair opposite her, the firelight casting angular shadows across his face. The intensity in his gaze was softened now, no longer the commanding presence that had guided them through the storm, but something quieter, more human. Eleanor dared to meet his eyes, and in that unspoken exchange, both acknowledged the delicate thread of connection forming between them, frail, fragile, yet undeniably present. "I have seen much in my years," he said finally, his voice low and measured, "and yet never have I encountered such endurance. You carry more than children upon your arms. You carry courage and grief in equal measure, and you do so without complaint." His words were neither flattery nor reproach. They were recognition, a rare and startling acknowledgment that pierced Eleanor more deeply than she could admit. She swallowed, uncertain how to respond, her voice barely a whisper. "I do what must be done, as any mother would." Yet even as she spoke, she felt the inadequacy of her words, the simplicity of her assertion unable to capture the depth of exhaustion, of fear, of relentless responsibility that had marked her days. The Duke inclined his head slightly, his expression thoughtful, and for a moment Eleanor imagined he might see through the layers she had built around her heart, the protective walls constructed over years of judgment and loss. A silence settled between them, warm and intimate, punctuated only by the soft crackling of the fire. Eleanor felt a strange courage rise within her, the unspoken need to confess, to share the burdens she had carried alone for too long. "It is not only the cold," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It is the fear that we are never seen, that our struggles are invisible to those who hold power. That the world believes we are lesser because circumstance has stripped us of our place." Her hands tightened around the blanket as if it were a talisman against both exposure and despair. The Duke leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze unwavering. "And yet you endure," he said softly, each word deliberate. "Not because anyone demanded it but because it is true to who you are. You do not survive for recognition or pity, you survive because your heart commands it. That truth, it is more formidable than society could ever comprehend." Eleanor felt a flutter of warmth she did not fully understand, gratitude, relief, and a cautious hope mingling in a heady, confusing swirl. A movement startled her and she glanced toward the cradle. The infant had stirred, reaching out with small, searching hands, and the Duke responded instinctively, lifting the child with care that was at once tender and assured. In the soft curve of his arms, she saw not only protection but a rare vulnerability, a hint of humanity beneath the rigid exterior of rank and responsibility. The sight stirred something deep within her, an awareness that even the most formidable could hold gentleness without diminishing strength. Words came then, unplanned and urgent, slipping between them like a fragile promise. Eleanor found herself speaking of losses too long suppressed, whispered regrets, the exhaustion of solitary survival, and the yearning for connection she had long denied. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression betraying no judgment, only attentive gravity. When he finally spoke, it was with the quiet authority of someone who bore experience and care in equal measure. "You are not alone. Not while I am here. Not while these children have breath, and not while truth remains stronger than rumor or fear." Eleanor's chest swelled with an emotion she could not name, a mixture of relief, longing, and a subtle fear of its potency. The distance that had always existed between them, the rigid manners, the unspoken social rules, the weight of her disgrace, softened in the glow of firelight and the warmth of shared acknowledgement. And yet, even in this intimacy, the world intruded. A faint knock at the heavy door, deliberate and unmistakable, shattered the fragile bubble, a reminder that sanctuary was never absolute, and that judgment, curiosity, or worse, had already begun its approach. Eleanor glanced at the Duke, eyes wide, searching for reassurance. His expression remained calm, yet something in the set of his jaw hinted at resolve, a readiness to face whatever intrusion might come. In that suspended moment, she understood that the choice to trust, to allow hope, to let the stirrings of affection take root, would demand courage beyond mere survival. And so, as the children slept and the firelight flickered against the walls, Eleanor realized that this night had altered the rhythm of her heart. She had glimpsed the possibility of understanding, of quiet devotion, of connection forged not by circumstance but by deliberate recognition. And somewhere in that fragile revelation, she sensed the storm beyond the walls had not yet passed, and that the Duke's presence, as comforting as it was, might soon be tested by forces neither of them could ignore. The ballroom was ablaze with candlelight, gilded mirrors reflecting 1,000 flickers across polished floors. Music swelled in stately crescendos, the strains of violins and cellos mingling with the rustle of silk and the soft murmur of polite conversation. Eleanor's hand trembled as she adjusted the folds of her gown, the fabric unfamiliar against her calloused fingers, her heart hammering with a mixture of dread and determination. To be seen here, under the Duke's protection, was an act as perilous as any blizzard she had endured. The walls of society were merciless, and whispers could wound far deeper than frostbite ever could. She entered the hall, her children momentarily hidden behind a discreet screen, their safety a tether anchoring her courage. Every eye she passed seemed to measure, to judge, to weigh the scandalous implications of her presence. Yet at the center of the room, the Duke waited, as steady and commanding as the ridge where he had first found her in the storm. His dark coat contrasted sharply with the soft glow of chandeliers, and his gaze, unwavering, sought hers with a magnetic insistence that belied mere etiquette. A hush rippled through the assembly as they recognized the scandal in motion. A lady of fallen fortune, escorted by a Duke whose reputation was as formidable as the pillars that framed the hall. Eleanor felt the weight of their stares, their whispered curiosities pressing against her like ice, yet she lifted her chin and met the Duke's gaze, drawing from him a quiet strength that steadied her trembling resolve. He offered his arm and she took it, each movement deliberate, the tension between them palpable yet restrained. "Tonight you are as you must be, visible, dignified, unafraid," he murmured just above the hum of the crowd. The intimacy of his words was private, a shield against the prying eyes, yet it resonated through her chest like a promise that she had almost forgotten could exist. They moved through the hall, each step an assertion of presence, a defiance of the scrutiny that sought to diminish her. The Duke's hand brushed hers occasionally, each contact deliberate, each glance holding weight, unspoken messages carried in the quiet spaces between words. Eleanor felt a strange exhilaration, the thrill of being truly seen, of having her courage acknowledged, not as spectacle but as truth. A whisper of movement drew her attention. A group of well-dressed ladies, faces pale and eyes sharp with judgment, murmuring accusations as delicately as a knife could cut. Eleanor's pulse quickened, yet she did not flinch. The Duke's hand, firm on her elbow, steadied her, and in that small gesture lay a declaration more powerful than any speech. He would not allow her to be diminished, not here, not ever. Music swelled once more, and the Duke led her to the center of the hall. Gasps fluttered across the room like startled birds, and Eleanor's cheeks burned, a heat of embarrassment mingling with an emotion she could scarcely name. He spoke then, his voice carrying over the notes, calm yet imbued with authority. "These walls have long celebrated rank and fortune," he said, eyes sweeping the assembly, "yet true worth is measured by courage, compassion, and the fidelity of one's heart. Here stands a woman who has braved the storm, protected the innocent, and carried herself with dignity beyond reproach." The room fell into stunned silence. Eleanor's breath caught. The children's safety, the precarious balance of her reputation, and the intensity of his gaze coalesced in a storm of emotion she had not anticipated. She could not speak, could only feel the weight of his words, each syllable a lifeline reaching across the gulf of fear and shame that had long defined her existence. The Duke did not pause, his declaration extending beyond her, into the hearts of those who sought to diminish her. "She is under my protection, and anyone who would question her honor must reckon with their own duplicity," he continued, each phrase a careful strike against the whispered judgments that lingered in the air. The force of his conviction was undeniable, and Eleanor, trembling yet resolute, allowed herself to believe that perhaps courage and virtue could outweigh the cruelty of rumor. As the music resumed, slower now, Eleanor felt the impossible stir of something else. A quiet hope, fragile yet persistent, that connection, true unyielding connection, was possible even amidst the strictures of society. The Duke's hand remained at her elbow, steady, grounding, a reminder that she was no longer alone. Yet even as relief and wonder mingled within her, a shadow flickered across the hall, a tall figure, unfamiliar yet unmistakably attentive, watching their every move with a calculating interest. Eleanor felt a chill unrelated to the winter wind, a reminder that the sanctuary of this evening, though luminous and commanding, was still vulnerable. And in that quiet moment of tension, as whispers and music intertwined with the heat of her own pulse, Eleanor understood with sudden clarity. The world beyond the ballroom walls would not yield easily, and the courage she had claimed tonight would soon be tested again, perhaps in ways she could neither foresee nor control. The dawn was pale and brittle, the sun a fragile coin of gold spilling across snow-draped lawns. Eleanor stood at the edge of the garden, her breath rising in trembling clouds, her hands clutching the folds of her gown as if they might anchor her to courage. The children were asleep inside, their faces serene and untroubled, oblivious to the storm of expectation and fear that lingered beyond the walls of the estate. For a moment she allowed herself to simply watch the wind stir the branches, the way frost glittered like scattered diamonds, and to feel the quiet ache of relief that had settled in her chest. The Duke emerged from the shadow of the portico, his coat dusted with frost, his expression a careful balance of resolve and something gentler, more intimate. He approached her slowly, each step measured, the crunch of snow beneath his boots echoing faintly in the stillness. Eleanor's heart surged, not with fear nor simply with hope, but with the recognition of a bond that had grown stronger in the trials of wind, cold, and whispered rumor. The hardships of the storm, the refuge of the estate, the quiet confessions of the night before, all had brought them here to a fragile threshold where vulnerability and trust intertwined. "You have endured much," he said, voice low yet commanding, carrying effortlessly across the frozen expanse. "And yet you stand, unbroken, unashamed, and in this truth, you have claimed more power than any society could grant or revoke." His eyes held hers, steady and unwavering, and Eleanor felt the weight of that gaze, the quiet assertion that her courage, her resilience, was not only seen but honored. She swallowed, the words lodged in her throat. "I only do what I must," she whispered, her voice fragile against the hush of snow and ice. "To protect them. To survive. The children." Her heart ached at their innocence, and she felt the shuddering pride of a mother who had carried them through the wilderness on sheer determination. The Duke stepped closer, and for the first time, Eleanor noticed the tremor in his composure, a subtle vulnerability beneath the veneer of unyielding authority. "You do more than survive," he said gently, reaching out to lift her gloved hand. "You shape the world around you with a courage others lack, and in doing so, you have drawn me to you whether by will or by fate." Eleanor felt a pulse of heat rise to her cheeks, a dangerous thrill she had long forbidden herself, and yet she did not pull away. The world, with all its rules and judgments, had shrunk to this moment, this acknowledgement, this fragile promise of connection. A sudden stir of movement inside the estate drew their attention. The children appeared at the window, rubbing sleep from their eyes, their small hands pressed against the glass. Eleanor's chest swelled with tenderness and fierce protection. The Duke followed her gaze, and for a moment the world beyond the garden, society, rumor, expectation, receded entirely. The lives they had saved, nurtured, and guided now stood before them, innocent and bright against the frost. He took her hands in both of his, warm and firm, grounding her in the certainty of presence. "No longer shall you walk alone," he said, voice steady and commanding. "Whatever storms may come, whatever society may whisper, you and these children are under my care, my vigilance, and my devotion. And I claim the right to stand by you, openly, without apology or reservation." Eleanor's breath caught, the enormity of his declaration sinking into her bones. Here was a man who dared defy the rules of propriety, who dared to declare what many feared to admit even to themselves, that love and loyalty could exist above judgment, rumor, and fear. Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes, not of sorrow but of release, of the impossibly sweet weight of hope finally recognized. "And I," she said, her voice firmer now, "will trust you. Not because the world demands it, nor because fortune favors it, but because you have seen me truly and have chosen to remain." Her words hung between them, a fragile yet unbreakable bridge over the chasm of doubt and societal expectation. The wind shifted, sweeping across the garden in a cold rush, yet they remained unmoved. Hands clasped, eyes locked, they shared a quiet intimacy born of shared hardship, whispered confessions, and the enduring recognition that trust, once given, could transform even the harshest winter into something golden and alive. The children's laughter echoed faintly from the window, a reminder of what had been preserved and what they had yet to protect. A distant sound reached Eleanor's ears, a carriage approaching along the snow-laden drive. Normally, it would herald scrutiny, the return of curiosity, or the intrusion of societal authority. Yet she felt no fear now, only the steady reassurance of the Duke's presence at her side. Whatever challenges awaited, they would face them together, fortified not by rank or wealth, but by the unassailable bond forged in storm, refuge, and trust. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his fingertips lingering for a heartbeat longer than propriety dictated. "The world will challenge us," he said softly, "but we have already endured more than it can throw. Let it come, we are ready." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, not with apprehension but with a thrilling certainty. She had survived the wilderness, survived whispers, survived doubt, and now perhaps she would survive love. The carriage slowed at the gates, its passengers hidden beneath cloaks, yet Eleanor did not flinch. She took a deep breath, her gloved fingers tightening around the Duke's. The frost glinted like diamonds on the branches, sunlight turning each flake to liquid gold. In that fleeting brilliance, Eleanor realized that the storm outside, the judgments of society, and the whispers of scandal were no longer forces that defined her fate. Her choices, her courage, and her heart would guide the path forward, and beside her stood a man whose presence promised not only protection but partnership, devotion, and a love forged in adversity. As the carriage doors opened and voices called across the snow, Eleanor felt a thrill of anticipation. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time, it was hers to claim. The Duke's hand tightened around hers, grounding her, affirming her, and together they stepped forward into the light, ready to face whatever awaited, hearts intertwined, unyielding, and unafraid.